development for reaching the Sustainable Development Goals, and really to show that billions can be turned into trillions. And a lot of you right now are developing those proposals, are already working on your integrated national financing frameworks or working on SDG investment proposals. So we want to acknowledge that amazing work and that it is groundbreaking and that it's not easy. So we just want to thank you. I just also want to acknowledge that as we prepare efforts to reach out to member states, the recent discussions at the General Assembly, at the Financing for Development engagements across heads of state, the initiative led by Jamaica and Canada around sustainable investing in the SDGs are something that we're aligning with. And it's events like today's that really give us more and more perspective on what you're doing at the country level that we can take back to the member states to show that in fact this rhetoric is becoming reality. So we just want to again thank you, appreciate our panelists, and look forward to a exciting morning. So back over to you, Max. Thank you.
Many thanks, Lisa. And again, please don't hesitate to write your question as we move on. We know that some of the concept will be quite rich in terms of sharing with you both expertise and experiences. So we really welcome also your feedback and your questions. Without further ado, I give the floor to our OECD colleagues. First to Paul to start his contribution. Thank you for Paul and OECD for joining us today.
Thanks, Max. Really appreciate that. And thanks to the SDG Fund for setting this up. I hope we can have lots of good questions and a conversation. We want to learn from everybody that's on the call as well. So this is a great opportunity for us through the UN to seek feedback on our work and get your advice and views on what we could do better to inform this policy discussion. So I'm going to split this a bit with my colleague Priscilla, who's been introduced. So it's a bit of a double act. And thanks for the kind introductions again, Max. And it was nice to hear from your colleague Lisa that gave a nice context as well. So I'm going to jump straight in and try and give a bit of a policy overview of how we see it at the OECD and sort of the DAC donors are currently looking at this whole agenda of moving towards mobilizing the private sector. We refer to this as mobilization, but I think my colleague Priscilla will be able to talk a bit about that, and we don't really use so much the concept of leverage. So if we can go to the first slide, please. So thank you. So how do we define this? Just to kind of give you a bit of a sense of how we're looking. Well, I mean, we are really looking at those financing sources. So we've got development, public and private at the bottom here. So the DAC donors, impact investors, and others that want to bring in the commercial finance, should be a much bigger bubble at the top there that we're trying to mobilize and bring in that non-concessional. So there's non-concessional in there because a lot of institutional investors, so pension funds, your pension funds, a lot of people want to invest according to the SDGs. So we're trying to mobilize them into developing countries, into markets that are going to help drive the SDGs. A big area, of course, has been climate, but not forgetting all the other SDGs. I think we as the Development Cooperation Directorate really focusing on leaving no one behind and really taking the agenda forward in terms of getting more private sector money into LDCs and those SDGs that aren't targeted by the private sector yet. So what sorts of things are going on at the second stage in terms of financial structuring? Well, this is what the SDG Fund does. I mean, essentially, that is a fund that's structuring, that's bringing together various sources of funding. But in there, you will have lots of other funds and facilities and other types of structures, funds of funds. That's where all the innovation, where a guarantee might sit in order to sort of mobilize the private sector because they're worried about foreign exchange or political risk. So that's where all the innovation, but where the development finance is taking those risks to ensure that the private sector to come in. So there's various types of mobilization, and it's happening at various levels. And then ultimately, you want to use that money as I've said, to drive the global goals. And I think we're at a critical point now with 2020, with COVID. We've got 10 years. This is a sort of, I think, an important point where we'll take a hard look in the mirror and see how we're doing in terms of mobilizing and addressing the goals, because the goals have just got bigger. The gaps just got bigger by quite a bit. Let me just define what we see as blended finance, because there are different views out there. I mean, we're really about mobilizing additional finance that wouldn't look at investing in developing countries. So we want to bring in those institutional investors that I spoke about into developing countries, make them comfortable by de-risking projects, encouraging a pipeline, giving the structures that can provide scale, looking at investment opportunities with a blended finance perspective, building markets where they didn't exist before, in climate, in agriculture, in other sectors that need to be built up in order to make sure that we're sort of decarbonizing our systems, but also making sure that we can have the technologies, the innovation, and not just the finance that will help drive the SDGs. If we can go to the next slide, please. So the OECD developed principles back in 2017 in the DAC high-level meeting. This is anchoring all our policy perspective. So over the past 3 years, we have developed guidance, which I'll talk a bit about, but let's just go back to 2017 to a bit of context. When we think about blended finance, we have this as our sort of guidebook, our sort of essentially our way of looking and roadmap to looking at any project in regards to blended finance. So you might look at a grant and you look at another project that's got a revenue stream and go, can I do that as a blended finance, or is it going to be something more traditional, maybe a grant type of project? If it's got a revenue stream, if it's got a potential to be commercial, then you'll look in terms of the blended finance context. The first thing you need to do is, though, how is it going to help development? Does it have a development rationale? Because if you're using development finance, it has to have a development rationale. The outcome, even if you're a small piece in the financial structure, or you're way back in terms of a fund of funds, you still want to make sure that that development finance money is contributing to development impact. The key, the second one, which is a big key one for this discussion, is around mobilizing. So we want to crowd in, not crowd out. We don't want to get into easy projects that the private sector would finance anyway. So it's always about calibrating, testing the project, testing the program to make sure that we are financially additional. We want to make sure that it's tailored to the local context, number 3. That means that you've got to look at local currency, developing local capital markets. I mean, there's always this foreign exchange mismatch. If you can develop in a local context with aligning it with the local priorities of the national local government, that makes it much more palatable and easier to get funding, and should have local funding to have that local ownership. So we also want to push that in terms of when you look at a blended finance project. The other is focusing on partnering. So the private sector, they're going to want to make money. You've got to, I mean, walk into this engagement with the private sector with that rationality, but we want development. So it's like bringing those two parties together and making sure that the incentives are aligned. Big one for the OECD is monitoring and evaluation. We want transparency. I mean, with only transparency will you start looking at Africa as an investment proposition and start having benchmarks developed. And it's really important that we have the evaluation coming back in terms of saying, well, how can blended finance improve? But also looking at the sort of impact of those projects. How are they delivering development, and sort of learning from those and feeding that back into the system. Next slide, please. So I mentioned our guidance. We just had that released by the DAC on the 25th of September. And it's 3 years of really detailed work that a lot of people like Convergence, that Chris will speak to and later, have been involved in. And we've developed the guidance. So have a look at our website, and all the principles under each of those, you've got really detailed guidance of like, how do I actually use principle 1? What does that concretely mean? I mean, there's very high level. So you can be a minister, but you can also be a program manager in Costa Rica, in East Africa, and you want to sort of understand how to deliver on these principles or how to deliver best practice, what's out there, then you will look at the guidance. We've also got this overarching piece that's also just been released by the DAC, and this is going to be sort of taken forward. We're going to keep them living documents, the underlying guidance, and contributing to them on things like COVID, and making sure that that guidance is fit for purpose, useful to you, and that you can effectively access it and learn from it and develop your blended finance operations and access all this funding that the MDBs, DFIs, OECD donors are now increasingly putting into the development system. Next slide, please. So I just want to sort of highlight this principle too. So this is really what we're talking a bit about today. So, I mean, to address that bigger gap that we're talking about in terms of the SDGs, it is going to be about mobilizing more. But you've got to kind of walk into this in a frame whereby, I mean, guarantees have been shown to mobilize a lot and been very effective, but at the same time, equity can be really impactful, and it might, over the short term, not mobilize a lot, but over the long term, create a market and allow further institutional investors to eventually come in. So you've got to really base, I mean, ensure the crowding in of that commercial finance at the various stages of a project. You want to basically have the context. So you've got to think a bit about how you're investing, what in terms of the regulatory, the local conditions are in the country. And you've got to sort of address failures. I mean, there are market failures in terms of allowing some of the technology, some of the ability to take SDGs from forward in terms of the lessons learned that we've done in regards to investing in environmental projects in OECD countries, like the way we've seen the growth and the adoption of mobile telephones in developing countries, and that meaning in terms of banking. So there's lots of ways that you can drive innovation and growth, but somebody's got to take that risk and help that to happen. A lot of the cases, this has been blended finance. You want to really exit. So, I mean, we are in the business of trying to find a way to get out. So you always want to look at how you can diminish your concessionality or non-concessionality as you move along the project. So eventually sort of maybe taking it from equity to debt to a guarantee, and eventually pulling it out of the project so that it can be sustainable over the long term. That's really, but all the details and information relating to Principle 2 are available on the guidance, which I encourage you to look at. Please, can we go to the next slide? So this is my final slide. This is just, I mean, I think we're some way there, but what we're talking about here in terms of attracting commercial funding, at the moment, we would probably say that there's too much blend, are not great at the moment. We want to get to a stage whereby we're attracting a lot more commercial finance and using less or equal amounts of blended finance. There's also this whole issue around having a common framework. And that's understanding what we're talking about in terms of blended finance, which I think this discussion, this webinar that's been put together will help. And it's an important conversation to sort of address that in terms of having a common understanding. Applaud the discussion around leverage, which is always coming up in policy discussions. The other one is really about having sort of figures, transparency, numbers. We really need to have a good way of assessing blended finance. And that's, I mean, some of the work that we're doing on impact and developing impact standards will help to sort of address that and provide the feedback loop to say, we need more, this is what the impact is, and that we can go back to our constituents and provide more of the evidence that they need to feel comfortable investing in some of these funds and facilities and other structures. So that's pretty much it for me. I'm going to now pass over to Priscilla. Thank you very much.
My role is really to give you an overview of the amounts that are mobilized from the private sector, so that you can get an idea of the size of the market, the financial instruments that are most commonly deployed, but also to have a bit more of an idea of which sectors and countries are being mostly targeted through mobilization. Just to say that the data I present to you is collected by our colleagues working on the statistics at the Development Cooperation Directorate. So this is data that the OECD collects on a yearly basis. So on this first slide, you can see on the left-hand side, actually, the amounts of finance that are being mobilized per year. And on the right-hand side, per instrument by official development finance interventions. So what's interesting is that you can see that in the period 2012 to 2018, there was a total of $205.1 billion US mobilized from the private sector. And there is clearly an upward trend over the period, which has significantly accelerated between 2017 and 2018. What you can see on the right-hand side is that guarantees mobilize the most private finance. So they account for about 39% of the amounts mobilized, and they are followed by syndicated loans and direct investments in companies or special purpose vehicles that you can see in the orange and sort of burgundy bubble on the right-hand side. So if we go to the next slide, we can see, so where these resources directed to, what's the spread across region. What's interesting to note is that between 2017 and 18, as you can see on this slide, the spread was quite even across region. Latin America was the region that benefited the most from mobilization. They had 9.5 billion mobilized, followed by Africa, which was quite close on 8.9 billion, and then Asia and Europe. So in Europe, we have all the developing countries in Europe, including Turkey. So it's interesting to see that the spread actually, it's quite even, and all regions were able to attract similar amounts of resources. However, if we go to the next slide, you will see that this this even spread across region does not mean that all countries or in different categories received the same amounts of resources. So if we look more in detail at income groups for the period 17-18, we can see that only 5.3% of the finance mobilized was actually going towards LDCs, so least developed countries, and lower income countries. So you see on this slide also that the bulk of the investment went actually to upper middle income countries. So this is an interesting trend that I think already shows us that in certain countries, it's possible to mobilize more finance, but this doesn't mean that there shouldn't be more attention placed on these least developed countries, which can actually benefit even more from the private finance mobilized. If we then look at the top sectors that you see on the bottom of this slide, you see that energy, banking and financial services, and also industry, mining and constructions were the sectors that attracted the bulk of the resources leveraged. And if we go to the next slide and we look at this a little bit more in detail, it's quite interesting to see that if we group sectors into these different categories, about 61.6% of the total amount mobilized targeted economic infrastructure and services. So you see on the top of the slides, energy, banking and financial services, just these two sectors alone attracted about, were the target of about 55.5% of the resources mobilized. If you go a little bit down this slide, you see social infrastructure and services attracted only 5.6% of the amounts mobilized. So this is an interesting slide, I think, and we can dig deeper into this during the conversations. And also, I think Chris will present a bit more detailed data on what they see at Convergence. But what this slide tells us is that really in certain sectors, it's already possible to mobilize larger amounts of finance, like, for example, in the energy sector, in the banking sector. And this is for many reasons. One reason is that certain sectors are perceived as being less risky by investors, or they can already provide sort of higher financial returns. However, this really does not mean that the social infrastructure sector should not be targeted, such as health, for example, or water and sanitation. We have done some additional research in the WASH sector. There is a report that you can download from the OECD website, where we really look at the benefits of blended finance approach in the water in the water supply and sanitation sector. So on the contrary, we don't think that this sector shouldn't be targeted, but we really see a lot of untapped potential for blended finance in these sectors, as we see a lot of untapped potential for blended finance in the LDCs. And we also believe that even if these sectors seem to be mobilizing less, still the little amounts that are being mobilized are very important, as Paul was saying earlier, to create the market. They can really, in being invested in projects that little by little show the track record in a sector and allow to, at some point, to really leverage higher amounts of resources, to the point that certain sectors in certain countries might not need anymore any official development assistance. So this is just to say that in general, the mobilization figures give an overview of the sectors, the countries, but they don't really provide a complete picture of how much development impact a certain project or a certain blended finance investment is having, and need really to be coupled with further analysis on the market creation of certain operations, which might seem at first look to be mobilizing less resources, but might really have a signaling effect and a market building effect that goes beyond really just the amounts that are being mobilized. So this was just a very brief overview. And with Paul, we are happy to take any question that you might have. Thank you.
We have two questions, one from Lisa and one from Jeremy. The question from Lisa is to connect what is the spaghetti-like, as describe it, situation and context in the policies in developing countries. What component one programs are currently tackling and working on, and the areas that link this policy work, maybe from tax, PPP to the blended finance discussion and these results on resource mobilization. So this is the first question, and I will also ask the second question, and then we will give the floor to Paul and Priscilla to answer. The second question is a bit about a specific context. So those are small island development states, the seeds, and if there is any specific consideration for those countries, both in the principles and in your policy discussions, and what may be some of the preconditions that would allow similar interventions in those contexts. So over to Paul and Priscilla to answer those two questions, and I will summarize the others while colleagues answer. Over to you, Paul and Priscilla.
Okay, maybe I will take a first stab at a couple of the first two, and then let Priscilla come in. I mean, I'm a big fan of spaghetti, but I do like to see things straight and organized as well. And that's where we are a bit with the blended finance. So what's the problem? I mean, the problem is a bit at the supply side and at the demand side. So on the supply side, we've got OECD, DAC donors, MDBs that sometimes have a different view on blended finance, and lots of different views about what's concessionality, non-concessional. At the OECD, we look at this a bit, DFIs that have portfolios, a mix of concessional and non-concessional money as one harmonious balance sheet that's working together to deliver on the SDGs. Now, there are other actors, and I mean, Chris and others, I mean, we do talk about blended concessional finance. We tend to look at it as one. So that's, maybe just one thing for the market to understand, in particular, the private sector. So having a sort of way to look at that. There's also, of course, a mismatch of regulatory from Basel to pension regulations, and we've seen quite a lot of money retreating from developing countries before COVID, and now increasingly more. And we want to really try and help OECD DAC regulators understand that on the one hand, their development systems are sort of pushing money and offering concessional finance. Their finance ministries and treasuries, on the other hand, need to have the regulatory frameworks in place that encourage funding to go to these countries, that their pension funds and others can access the fast growing and opportunities, and the SDG gaps are the biggest in developing countries. So that's where a lot of the potential for returns in this pretty stagnant and financial environment that we will be seeing, continue to be seeing. So it's trying to sort of get some of those regulatory hurdles understood and dealt with, and the common framework for looking at blended finance, but also impact. And I'll let Priscilla talk a bit about that, because she's been delivering a big work piece on that. The other on the sort of demand side from developing countries, I mean, typically it's often easier to get a grant than sort of going through the rigmarole of trying to sort of put together your equity dossier and going through an investment committee. And then there's different ways of doing that. Guarantees, the sort of standard documentation on guarantees can be varying enormously. If you had one sort of standard template that lawyers could look at and go, yep, that's good, I'm happy with that one, I saw it last week, that would help enormously the system and the pipeline, and stop guarantees being held up in terms of the pipeline of projects and the sort of long time it takes, and also increase the scale, and sort of ultimately we're trying to get the private sector to bring their big money into these contexts, into the SDGs, but we want to have it with a development rationale. So we've got to make it easier as well. And so developing countries also should look to investing in their own projects, not putting money in Dubai or London property. That there should be, I mean, the sovereign wealth funds that we've seen, like FONSIS in Africa, investing in water, investing in other sectors that are critical and are just growing, are really important to deliver on this blended finance. The agenda's growing, the market's growing, and ultimately the private sector's got to see us as all working together. Otherwise, they tend to pick us off and work around sort of various cracks in the development system. On SIDS, I mean, we've done a lot of work with a colleague, Piera, in the Development Cooperation Directorate, and she's actually featured some of our work in the Sustainable Development Investment Partnership around blended finance. There are some good case studies. I mean, we've looked at some of the things around when the SIDS have been hit by big sort of climate events, and how insurance and guarantees has helped to return them, in a bit in terms of the COVID context around the whole cruise ship business that's sort of disappeared, and trying to encourage that and bring the private sector back into those economies which are so exposed to tourism through blended finance instruments that sort of encourage further investment and activity in some of those jurisdictions which are so much more exposed than others. So I can put you in touch and give you some more details on some of the work that we're doing there and the person that's involved with that. Priscilla, over to you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Paul. I think just to complement what you were saying, maybe looking a little bit more about that question that you raised about the impact, and the fact that there is sort of no agreement on a framework on how to measure the development impact of blended finance. This is really a big block, because this does not allow to be able to compare projects, and also makes it very difficult for policymakers to understand better what kind of impact development impact they can generate when they invest or put resources into blended finance projects, or when they try to support sort of private investors to achieve the SDGs. So as Paul was saying, we have, as the OECD, embarked in a journey to work with donors and other private sector actors, including, of course, investors, DFIs, and others, into trying to understand better what's the development impact. And we have been working on what we call the impact standards for financing sustainable development, which are a framework for donors and other private sector partners to get together and understand what are the elements of a good impact management system that would allow to better manage for development outcomes when it comes to blended finance. So we hope that this work will inspire all different actors that are engaged in blended finance transactions to together find ways to measure and manage the impact of these investments, because unless we have this sort of common framing, common way of looking at it and increased transparency, it will be very difficult for blended finance to prove that it's a useful tool in the toolbox and to be able to scale and become really the tool that, as Lisa was saying at the very beginning, can help achieve the Agenda 2030. So,
many thanks, Paul and Priscilla. I have two quick questions also, that there are a lot of questions that I think can be answered also in the process and as we prepare for the final discussion. But I just wanted to have probably also a concise answer so we can also move to Chris and he can also address some of the questions. I think two of them were quite interesting. Let's say the dominant instruments that you put on your slide are the better ones or are just the most common ones? So it's, and the second question, which and also there was particular reference to guarantee and some, but I think that's the conundrum of the question. The second question is, if shortly, how much are you confident that there is enough results on blended finance? Like sometimes we always speak about amounts, etc., but we are not always still able to have aggregated information on the impact. So just if you could shortly answer to those questions before we move to Chris. And also to Chris, there were several questions that you might take into consideration, including the issues related to the impact of COVID on transactions and blended finance, and as well as some more specific questions. But I give back to Paul and Priscilla. I don't know who wants to answer before we move to Chris on the next stage. And thank you for your questions. We'll also answer in the box. Thank you.
Priscilla, maybe.
Yeah, so maybe just to say that the slide only shows the one that are mostly used, let's say. So this is based on data that the OECD collects. So basically, the OECD asks to the organizations that structure the deals which instruments they've been using. We are starting to do some additional work on guarantees to assess whether they're good instruments, and we have certain findings, and we'll soon have, I think in a month from now, more or less, organize a webinar as part of our community of practice on private finance for sustainable investment to discuss guarantees. The other thing is whether we already see enough results in blended finance. I think in a way blended finance, but this is really my perspective, and I'm curious to see also what Paul thinks. It's a relatively new instrument, so it's somehow difficult to see very quickly the results, especially when blended finance is used to create a market. So blended finance, as we were saying, is really trying to provide sort of a rationale for the engagement of the private sector. And I think it needs to build a certain track record before we can really talk about the results of blended finance more in terms of like at macro level. But please, Paul.
I mean, I would complement that and just say, I mean, there has been blended finance as a concept since 2015 has gained, and we've seen a lot more money going into IFIs that have concessionality, and the DFIs, assets under management, have been increasing. I mean, before that, there was a sort of concept of blended finance, but it was more around PPPs directly going through the sovereign. So, I mean, the EIB, BRD, and Chris can talk to that, have been doing sort of guarantees and equity investments in one shape or the other. But I think that the SDG agenda in 2015 have really sort of pushed that and brought in development finance, impact investing to a sort of a whole new level. I think that the results are still being developed, and it's sometimes as we get more sophisticated and more and look at this in terms of very short time frames, it's difficult to sort of identify X equals Y and get the results the way that we've been thinking about this in a grant, typically donor focus. So it does require a new perspective, new way of looking at this. So I don't think we can immediately replicate from the way we've been doing it in the past. And that's, I think, the challenge that we all sort of have to work towards and address that. But the OECD, through the work that Priscilla is doing on impact, I think that's greatly improving and will bring a lot more in terms of the monitoring and the measuring and management of impact as well. So, and DFIs have made a lot of progress in that respect as well. So I think the market is responding to what people are saying.
Thank you, Paul and Priscilla. I think that's also a good point. So the question is reverted back to our team. Actually, the UN here has a huge role to play. Also, if Foda was asking about accountability, a lot of it's actually in your hands as well in the countries you work with. So that it's very important to have accountability as a critical part of component 1 programming. I'm sure you all know, but beyond that, also to the work of the United Nations in the different countries. So that it's a bit our collective responsibility. We are a bit late, so without further ado, I will give the floor to Chris, and thank you for your patience, Chris.
Thanks so much, Max. Appreciate it. So Max and Lisa, on that point, I see that we have 303 participants here. I can only imagine the flow of questions is beyond our capacity to answer today. So we'll volunteer myself, Adi, and Aisha, who I'm on the phone call with. If you can cluster them together and maybe share them with ourselves in OECD, we can actually provide more substantive answers to the questions versus just over the course of this engagement. That's an offer. Hopefully you'll take it up. I'm Chris Clubb from Convergence, and for those of you who don't know us, we work very closely with Paul, Priscilla, and the OECD. And what Paul and Priscilla just showed you is an excellent report called the OECD Blended Finance Funds and Facilities Survey. And in it, I believe they had responses from 180 organizations that identified blended finance vehicles of around 60 billion. Now, that activity includes two types of development finance. That development finance that is implemented regularly by multilateral development banks and DFIs, IFC, African Development Bank, EBRD, UK CDC, German DEG. But then there's also other types of blended finance with development finance in it, which is implemented by, let's say, USAID or Swiss SACO or Swedish SIDA, where they're providing their funds on a much more catalytic and concessional basis. And Convergence, everything we're about to show you here, we focus on a subset of the breadth of blended finance. We really focus on blended finance where there's the intentionality of allocating funding to a blended finance transaction to achieve development impact, but you're taking on a risk return that is below market risk return. You're taking on a higher risk or a lower return than the market would require for the purpose of achieving development impact and mobilizing finance. So with that as background, I'm going to walk you through some slides, okay? Next slide, please. So your colleagues at UNCTAD and the United Nations Sustainable Development Solutions Network have done some great analytical work on this notion of, well, what is the 2.5 billion SDG investment gap in low and middle income countries? And that's the third column here, the SDG investment gap of around 2.5 billion. But they've gone one step further and looking at, okay, if that's where the gap is, and if one looks at in regular economies, upper middle income countries, high income countries, what part of that type of funding is actually provided by the private sector versus the public sector? It begins to allow us in the blended finance field to begin to focus on the SDGs and the sectors where private investment is provided in high income countries and can be mobilized much more readily. And it begins to allow us to focus a little bit more, if we are going to be using blended finance as a development tool, well, which particular sectors and projects should we be focused on? And as you'll see here, the core, if we're mobilizing private investment, it needs to come to underlying projects and sectors and SDGs where there are revenues, where the private sector investor expects to be repaid and expects to earn a return on capital there. So it's not the appropriate tool for all 17 SDGs. It begins to cluster around certain SDGs and certainly begins not to cluster around other SDGs where public funding and grants are much more important. Next slide, please. Now, why is blended finance important? Depending on whether we look at a UN list, a World Bank list, an OECD list, there's around 145 developing countries out there. Only 12% of them are rated investment grade by Moody's, S&P, and Fitch. 88 are not rated investment grade. And the median rating using an S&P equivalent is B+. So right off the bat, if we had a bunch of private investors in this phone call, the debt investors would say, well, there's no way we're putting our funding into a country that is rated B+. And equity investors would also say, we're not going to take on that country risk in our equity portfolio. So essentially, we lose the large majority of prospective cross-border investors in your median style of developing countries. Sure, they can invest in some of the upper middle income countries, but collectively, we want them investing in lower middle income countries, low income countries. And they see the country risk as being too high. So the core of blended finance is to mobilize investment to good fundamental projects, but happen to sit in high country risk environments. And that's where this leverage aspect of what we'll talk about later. Next slide, please. So beyond the country risk itself, you know, our colleagues at the GIN have actually surveyed their members and asked about the specific risks when they're making investments into quote unquote impact investment. What are the risks that really they look at and really keep them away from investing? And the ones here circled in red are the ones which are systemically present in low and middle income countries. So beyond the macro country risk down into the individual project risk, these risks are overwhelmingly present in developing countries. Next slide, please. So the core of blended finance, if anyone's taken Finance 101, this is the capital asset pricing model that private investors would ultimately use. We have this market efficient line, whether it's debt or equity, but this is primarily a debt investment line that says investments on this line sloping upwards. If we make investments at this line or above the line, then we're making market efficient investments. Unfortunately, too many of the investments that we're looking to mobilize investment to in developing countries fall below this line. The risk is too high, the return isn't enough. So we have many projects that sit at point A on this matrix. Blended finance can do one of two things. It can change the risk profile and move that project from A to B to get it to a market equivalent line, or it can actually outright, let's say, subsidize the deal and move it from A to C by boosting the return for that particular risk. Both are possible. The large majority of blended finance today practice is moving it from A to B, altering the risk profile. One of the benefits of that is there is a big difference between the perceived risk by the market for these countries and investments in these countries relative to what is actually unfolded, the actual risk. If one were to look at the senior loans by the multilateral development banks and DFIs in what they call the Global Emerging Markets Database, the GEMS database, the actual level of defaults and losses have been 85% lower than what one would expect if one were to use Moody's, S&P, and Fitch's data. So the actual risk profile from that set has been much lower. You look at HSBC or Standard Chartered or Standard Bank's assets, and they're defaulting at a much lower rate than one would expect given the high country risk. So there's a huge difference between perceived risk and actual risk, certainly in the debt market. Next slide, please. But blended finance is only one of the tools in the development toolbox. As we all know, there's around 150 billion allocated annually by the 30 DAC members, either multilaterally or bilaterally, to development. Probably around 2% of that funding comes into blended finance. It is very much a junior tool. We need to understand how is it best deployed if it is going to continue to be a junior tool to get the most efficient through good practices. But let's be honest, especially in low-income countries, the large majority of funding needs to continue to be grant. That isn't around orienting, mobilizing private investment. We just need to maximize and optimize the amount of activity in blended finance to make it much more effective. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned earlier, we focus on blended finance that has a level of concessionality by an organization, whether it's the Gates Foundation or the Rockefeller Foundation or USAID or UK DFID or Global Affairs Canada. And we have 589 blended finance transactions in our database that have mobilized around 141 billion of total funding. And we've mapped each of those to one or multiple SDGs. And these are the SDGs that have been targeted directly by those 589 blended finance vehicles. As we can see, the ones that are on the top tend to really systemically have underlying revenues that can be used to repay the private sector. And those at the bottom don't have the revenues that can be used to repay the private sector. So we immediately understand there's essentially three types of SDGs. SDGs where it's a little easier to mobilize private investment, SDGs where it's a middle complication, and other SDGs where we really shouldn't be using blended finance at all, or it's really kind of a cottage industry at that level. Next slide, please. Now, blended finance and the use of concessional or catalytic funding can be done at an individual project level. Let's say there's a 120 megawatt renewable power project in Burkina Faso that needs to have a financing structure. Concessional capital can come in for that particular transaction, or at the other end of the spectrum, it can be done on a portfolio basis. What we have found is investors are much more interested in participating in portfolios of transactions versus individual standalone transactions. If we've all taken Finance 101, as soon as you get up to around 8 or 10 individual investments, you achieve a level of diversification that brings down risk. Therefore, they want to be exposed to lower risk. Therefore, portfolio is a much better approach to be mobilizing investment from private sector. Next slide, please. But I think we all know private investors, even still today in 2020, they are not lining up to be investing in under the mandate of developing countries or low-income countries or middle-income countries. As a matter of fact, they're churning off of what they call emerging markets. And in their mind, Croatia is an emerging market, as an example, okay? Where there is a huge interest coming from private investors is under these investment streams, strategies, and themes, okay? We all know about the UN principles for responsible investment, so responsible investing is one of them. SDG investment, social investing, ESG is probably the biggest growth area. So we in the development community, if we want to be attracting investment to our countries of interest, it really has to be, in our view, under the banner of ESG investment or others. They're allocating capital to ESG investments. They're not really lining up to be allocating capital to LDCs and fragile conflict afflicted countries. We need to be creating blended finance vehicles that will mobilize them on their investment mandates and their interests, which fall more in these boxes. Now we're going to spend the next several slides on next slide, next 2 slides forward, please. Next slide, yeah, please. Now we're going to go into leverage of what we have observed in our database of 589 blended finance transactions, okay? And when we're walking through this data, the ratio that we're using is, the numerator is commercial capital. That is money being deployed either by the private sector or by multilateral development banks or DFIs pursuant to a commercial mandate. They're looking for market investment or near market investment. Divided by the denominator is, well, concessional capital. This is money being allocated by USAID and the Gates Foundation in a blended finance transaction. Now, when we look at the universe of transactions of 157 projects that we call funds or facilities in our database of 589, because we have individual projects and other, but just looking at the funds and facilities. So this could be a private credit fund or a private equity fund, as an example. And we look at the leverage ratio there. The median has been 3.4 times, and the average has been 5.1 times, okay? Now, we need to take a pause here. It's much more easy to do the mathematics on leverage when we're trying to mobilize debt investors, because debt investors all look at the probability of default and the loss given default when they're making an equity investment. And it's a very analytical process. So I can tell you right off the bat, if we want to be mobilizing investors to a portfolio of underlying projects that are single B, and they require a triple B equivalent rating at the end of the day, then it's a relatively simple mathematical exercise to move from point A to point B. Whereas equity, it's a little more complicated, okay? So where you see here, these are funds and facilities that might be mobilizing debt or equity. We haven't broken it down here by debt or equity. Next slide, please. Now that leverage, as you remember, the leverage ratio, the median was 3.4. And the numerator was MDB financing in private sector. Unfortunately, a lot of that concessional capital is being partnered with MDB and DFI finance, okay? It's the majority of the commercial capital being mobilized has been MDB and DFI financing. So if we take the median of 3.4, and here the median of private sector at 0.76, we broadly have a leverage factor of around 2.7 for MDB and DFI financing, but only 0.76 for private sector. So the large majority of blended finance today it is being implemented is a combination of concessional money with MDB and DFI regular capital and some private sector funding. Now, next slide, please. If we take a different lens and looking at the geographies of a smaller subset of transactions, and we have this database, we've looked at, well, where has been the primary area where the funding has actually flowed to? You can see that global and Latin American and Caribbean has achieved a much higher level of, let's say, sub-Saharan Africa. That's natural. If we look at this country ratings in Latin America and Caribbean, and we look at the size of the economies there relative to sub-Saharan Africa has much higher country risk ratings than does Latin America in general. And therefore, in general, you can get a higher level of leverage when we're looking to mobilize in upper middle income countries versus lower income countries, and certainly much more than in LDCs. So that's it from a country or regional perspective. Moving on to the next slide, please. Now, this is where we're looking at quote unquote sectors, okay? So the largest leverage we've seen achieved has been in the infrastructure space and financial services, okay? That's total. And then the smaller, the grayish bar here is private sector mobilization, okay? So in the infrastructure space, we've seen for every dollar of concessional money, they've mobilized $4.50 of MDB and commercial money, and that includes $1.7 of commercial money. So we've probably seen the highest level of leverage here in infrastructure. Financial services, usually that isn't just for financial companies, it's for ultimately the end beneficiaries. That's for SME financing, micro enterprise financing, that's for rural and agricultural and smallholder financing. That goes all into this basket of financial services, where the financial intermediary is just essentially the conduit to our end target being something smaller. Next slide, please. We've also sliced and diced it by the SDGs themselves to give you an order. There's the 4.1, that's the mathematical average, not the median. And here's how the SDGs themselves have compared with that. And it's interesting, if we look at the bottom here, these are areas where SDG 14 onwards, where there haven't been many blended finance transactions, and the leverage in those SDGs has been lower for a variety of reasons. Next slide, please. I'm going to try and wrap up here and field as many questions as we possibly can. So here are some of the key considerations. The first one is the most important that I mentioned, okay? Number one, are we trying to mobilize debt or equity? If it's debt, it becomes much more of a mathematical exercise. If we know the underlying ratings of the individual underlying projects relative to the investment needs, okay? Equity is a little more complicated. There's a different process there, but here's some of the other things. As we've seen here, ultimately, the biggest driver, I think, of beyond the debt and equity split is ultimately the underlying risk of the countries we're trying to mobilize investment to. The higher risk the countries, i.e. the more that they're LDCs in fragile and conflicted situations, or low-income countries, broadly speaking, the more complicated it is. And then, quite frankly, from a sector or SDG perspective, the more that there's kind of a clear understanding of what the underlying revenues are that can be used to remunerate the private sector, the higher level of leverage that can be achieved also. And lastly, it's maturity. We have a database of 589 transactions. One of the reasons why we've created it, we want everyone to have access to this database so the next generation of blended finance transactions can be better than the previous one. They can have better development impact, higher leverage, lower concessionality, higher financial additionality, all of these things which we track in this database. So with that, Max and Lisa, I really pass back to you to take on any questions that might come up.
Yeah, many thanks, Chris. And colleagues, I think a lot of you have asked us about benchmarks, about possible average. I mean, this is the best you can get. Like this is still probably, so many thanks, Chris, for sharing this with us. Also be always careful that some of these numbers need to really be considered in your specific context. So that's why if every one of you actually ask us to give you, a sense of what is our target, target rate for leverage, et cetera, et cetera. This has really need to be done and studied at your specific context. So, but thanks, Chris, for bringing this to us. There are a lot of of course, the UN is working on some of the most difficult contexts or sectors. So some of the questions are, what we can do in, in those situations like, Libya, this was one of the most difficult contexts. Like, what are some of the early steps? When actually we should get into it while we consider maybe some preliminary measures. So in some of these contexts like seeds or conflict countries or particular sector like WASH or other where it's a bit more difficult, what would you advise as a strategy or considerations that you might have from your experience? And the second one also is a lot of times the role of these interactions with the private sector is still somehow misunderstood. Sometimes they are service providers, sometimes they are seen as implementers, sometimes are co-financer. Do you have any lesson to share about way to manage those risks and way to make sure that accountability is preserved? So a bit of how this applying to a bit more difficult situation and off the grid kind of types, and also a bit of the magic, if you wish, of the relationship with the private sector in those transactions and public institutions.
Yeah, so to answer that first question, when it comes to what we've seen and what historically what we see unfolding right now, obviously, the more that we have blended finance vehicles that are focused on one project, on one country, or one or multiple countries that tend to have really high risk ratings, the more we see private investors being very reluctant to put money there. Okay, so please keep in mind, if we go back to our ratio there of concessional versus commercial capital, there are at least 3 buckets of funding that we're putting in that numerator, right? We're putting number 1 is MDB and DFI financing. And unfortunately, still today, as we sit here, if you look at the aggregate of MDB and DFI financing today, around 85% of that financing flows to middle income countries and only 15% to low income countries. So even those guys are not really putting a lot of money into low income countries in general, and they should be the ones most interested. The second is institutional, and really what we describe as money that's being managed pursuant to a real commercial mandate. They're going to look at these countries and these particular sectors, and it's going to be very difficult to mobilize them. If we're really trying to mobilize capital to the really difficult part of what we see in the development spectrum, these countries, these individual difficult projects, or these individual SDGs, I really think we should be factoring away from traditional commercial investors and be focused on either the MDBs and DFIs or the third group, which is those that we've described really as impact investors. Those that genuinely are prepared to allocate capital where development is much more important necessarily than the financial risk return in the funding, okay? So if we really are trying to mobilize to those difficult spaces, we're not big fans of spending a lot of time coming up with a structure to mobilize commercial investors, because what we've seen historically, especially now with COVID-19, that's the highest piece of hanging fruit that we have out there. That's very, very complicated. So I tried to answer that. I'm also conscious of time, Max. Did you want me to answer any other questions?
I think it's at this point, we will keep it for the discussion later on. So I think there are a lot of questions actually around also the role of the UN. And I guess, Fabrizio, you will be on the spot on this, also asking what's the UN value add. And I think also some examples from the field and also UN agencies, and also to your remark, Chris. I think in most of also what has been proposed to the Joint SDG Fund, there is a DFI or an MDB. So those will be, in most situations, of course, an important partner and part of the picture. And we have seen that both for the multilateral, but also an important role in actually structuring the creation of, if you wish, national DFIs or national funds. So without further ado, and this is our last presentation before the discussion, and we will follow up on several of your questions that you had with our panelists. Thank you for your patience. I think this is actually quite an important one, because it gives you a sense of what is really happening and give you some examples of how one UN agency, in particular UNCDF, is tackling the matter. So over to you, Fabrizio, and please be aware of time as you move forward, so we will have also an opportunity to have a good discussion afterwards. Over to you, Fabrizio.
Thanks, Max, and thanks for organizing this very interesting webinar. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, colleagues. Very pleased to be here. So maybe let me start with a disclaimer. The disclaimer I'd like to make is that my presentation won't be in any way the methodology or the official methodology that the UN should use to calculate leverage. There are many different ways of calculating leverage, but my presentation will just be a reflection of the type of calculation we do at UNCDF when we engage in blended finance transactions. So my objective for today is really to share with you our experience on blended finance and leverage, provide some very concrete case studies of blended transactions that we've implemented in the field and calculating leverage for each of those. And then last but not least, share some ideas on how the wider UN development system can use and take advantage of UNCDF's investment architecture. Next, please. So most of you, I assume, know UNCDF. The only thing I'd like to highlight is that UNCDF is one of the few UN agencies that has an investment mandate, which allows it not only to deploy grants, but also to deploy loans and guarantees in a concessional manner, focusing primarily on least developed countries, and the ability to deploy these financial instruments, loans and guarantees, with the public sector, of course, but in particular way with the private sector, and ranging from small and medium enterprises to larger projects. Next slide, please. So UNCDF has really developed a suite of financing solutions which really are thought to enable access to commercial finance for small and medium enterprises, financial service providers, and municipal projects in LDCs. We have three main pillars and three main financing solutions. The first one on the left-hand side is basically UNCDF direct investment operations. As I said, we have an investment mandate. We can receive grant money from donors, and we can deploy these resources either in the form of grants, but also concessional loans and guarantees. This is what we call our balance sheet investment, and it's usually investment in very risky area, very risky businesses. But to complement our architecture, we've also decided to engage with third-party asset manager, private asset manager, to set up blended finance vehicles. And we're currently working on two such initiatives. One is called the Build Fund, which is targeting really the missing middle and SMEs. And the fund manager there that we have selected is Bamboo Capital Partner. And the other one is the International Municipal Investment Fund, which is targeting municipalities and PPPs. And the fund manager that we've selected to work on this is Meridian, based out of Paris. Next slide, please. So these financing solutions really provide an investment architecture that is aimed at supporting projects, companies, all along the different stages of development. And this is what we call the investment continuum. So this architecture starts on the left-hand side with UNCDF capability to identify potential interesting investment opportunities, projects that are in need of finance, mostly in these developed countries. And we do that in a number of ways: challenge fund, request for proposal, etc. And then some of these projects might be very early stage, and we can support them with seed funding, and usually using grants. But as this company develop, then we can start deploying some other tools, and we can start providing maybe concessional loans or guarantees. And maybe we can also then pass them over to this blended finance vehicle that I was describing, so the Build Fund and the IMI Fund. I think that what is important here in this slide is to realize that everything we do at UNCDF has one main objective, which is to catalyze additional investment from the private sector, additional commercial investments. So our holy grail, if I may say, is on the right-hand side of the slide, when those projects are sufficiently mature and ripe so that the private sector can take over and provide finance to them. Now, next slide, please. How do we create leverage in this architecture? Well, we create leverage in a multiple number of ways. First, by bringing in other financial institutions at any stage of this continuum. Next slide. We can also create leverage through our blended finance vehicles, and I come to that in a minute. But these are clearly structured blended finance vehicles that have a leverage embedded into it. And finally, next slide, we can provide leverage by bringing on board at a later stage additional commercial finance. Next slide. So let me give a number of examples, concrete transactions that we've done at UNCDF. The first one is a company called Alaska. This is an agribusiness located in Tanzania. They needed to develop their manufacturing line and they needed to purchase equipment. They were in negotiation with a bank called the TADB, a Tanzanian bank, but the bank was not ready to provide all of the needed financing and wanted also his risk return profile to be improved. So next slide, please. So this is really what we did. We blended a concessional loan from UNCDF with a senior loan from TADB. The concessional loan from UNCDF was with a 6% interest rate per annum, whereas the senior loan from TADB was provided with an interest rate of 15% per annum. So that's a concrete example of leverage. The loan from TADB was $170,000, whereas the loan from UNCDF was $98,000. So how can we calculate leverage here? Next, please. So here it's very easy, it's just like Chris described, that's the definition. We put commercial finance on the numerator, we put concessional finance on the denominator. We have $170,000 on the numerator, $98,000 on the denominator. That's basically a leverage of 1.7x. Next slide, please. Now, let me give you another example of blended transaction, also using another type of financial instrument. And I saw that in the chat box, there were questions about guarantees. And guarantees for sure is a powerful tool to achieve leverage. So this is the case of a company based in Uganda called Pristine Foods that wanted to set up the first liquid egg processing facility in East Africa. So it's a greenfield project, or it was a greenfield project. And they had been discussing with a private funder called the Yield Fund, which is a fund in Uganda managed by Pearl Capital Partners. And Pearl Capital Partners approached UNCDF to see if we could provide a guarantee on a share of their investment. So next slide, please. So this is how it worked. In this case, the Yield Fund provided a $454,000 senior loan that was cushioned and protected by a 50% guarantee by UNCDF, with a maximum guarantee ceiling of $220,000. Next slide. So here we can calculate leverage once again. We put the $454,000 in the numerator. We put the 50% of that covered by UNCDF, $227,000 on the denominator, and here we achieve a leverage of 2x. However, and this is where we see that leverage could be calculated in many different ways, there's a little caveat to that. Because on top of the senior loan that was provided by the Yield Fund, the same Yield Fund also provided $200,000 in equity. So should we consider equity as finance, which has been mobilized thanks to the guarantee? Some might argue that yes, because maybe without the guarantee from UNCDF, the deal would just have not gone through. So let's see what happens on leverage if we include those $200,000 of equity. Next slide. So all of a sudden, the numerator becomes $654,000, the denominator remains $227,000, and here we have achieved a 2.9x type of leverage. So these are two examples of blended transaction. And again, referring back to what Chris was saying, you have different ways of making blending. You can blend at project level, transaction level, but you also can blend at fund level. So next slide, please. So the next example I'd like to share with you is the example of the Build Fund, which is a blended finance structured vehicle, which is aimed at attracting different type of capitals. So the Build Fund basically is constituted of three different tranches of capital. At the bottom of the capital stack, you have a catalytic first loss tranche. This is primarily a tranche that will be financed by donors, very patient capital, grant capital. This grant capital will cushion a mezzanine tranche, which is on top, which will target primarily DFIs and MDBs. And finally, the first loss and the mezzanine tranche will protect the senior tranche, which is targeting primarily a commercial investor and institutional investors. Okay, The target for this fund is to reach a capitalization in time of 250 million. And the ideal structure we are envisioning is to have 50 million catalytic first loss tranche, protecting 75 million of mezzanine tranche, and the two of them protecting a senior tranche of $125 million. And here, just to be clear, when you do this kind of vehicle, basically what happens is that financial returns flow top to down. So the first one to get a financial return are the holder of the senior tranche, whereas risk flows bottom up. And the first one to be hit by defaults are the holder of the catalytic first loss tranche. So how does leverage work in this situation? Next slide, please. So here you have two ways again of looking at things, and it very much depends on who is providing the mezzanine tranche. So if the mezzanine tranche is concessional, then you would have 125 million on top, 125 million on the bottom, and you will achieve a leverage of 1x. However, next slide, please. If the mezzanine tranche is commercial, then the leverage calculation dramatically changes, because you're going to have all of a sudden 200 million on the numerator. You will have only the 50 million of first loss as a denominator, and the leverage becomes 4x. So again, not a single way of calculating leverage, and very much depends on the type of capital that you're going to end up attracting. Next slide, please. So the last case study I wanted to share with you is a case study which I think could relate well to what a lot of the UN agencies are doing. Because sometimes what we do at the UN is not directly blending a transaction of fund level. Sometimes what we do is that we manage to mobilize additional resources, but in a sequential way. So let's admit that a UN agency provides a grant, or a UN agency like UNCDF provides loans, and nobody else comes on board at that stage. But then at a later stage, because we made the case, because of the demonstration effect that we were able to show, then we are able and we are in a position to attract additional commercial finance. And that's exactly the case of Aptec. So Aptec is a company in Uganda operating in the renewable energy sector. It's an off-grid PV system and solar water pumps provider. The company was performing well, it was growing. They were knocking at the door of many commercial banks in Uganda because they wanted to keep growing. But unfortunately, because they didn't have collateral, because they didn't have credit history, they were unable to attract private finance. So what UNCDF did is that we provided the first loan ever to the company. And we provided a loan of $250,000 at a relatively concessional interest rate of 15%. Next slide, please. So this is really what you see here. The first step was UNCDF to provide a loan. However, because Aptec was able to repay that loan and show that it could be a good borrower, in a second step, that's when we were able to mobilize private finance. Next slide. And the next step was really to attract Stanbic Bank, which is a Uganda local commercial bank, to provide additional capital for $700,000 with different type of facilities, but basically credit lines and some factoring facility. So how could we look at the leverage here? Next slide, please. So here the leverage could be calculated as $700,000, which is the finance mobilized sequentially through Stanbic, divided by $250,000, which was the initial concession loan provided by UNCDF, and we would achieve a leverage of 2.8x. Okay. Now let me stop here because can we go back to the previous slide just very quickly? What if instead of providing a $250,000 loan, UNCDF had provided a $250,000 grant? How would leverage look in this situation? Well, basically the figures don't change. The figures do not change. You still have the same numerator and you still have the same denominator. So you could argue that by providing a grant, we would also have achieved a 2.x leverage. However, there is something that I think we should take into account is that a grant, when it's disbursed, it's never gonna revolve. It's not coming back. So you will achieve that 2.x leverage only once. However, if you're providing a loan instead of a grant, then that grant is going to be repaid. And if it's repaid, it's capital that you have available again to redeploy with another company. So in that case, one could argue that you're going to increase your leverage by deploying that same $250,000 in multiple transactions, and at the same time, of course, increase your developmental impact, because the same $250,000 will have supported 2 different companies instead of just maybe 1. Next slide, please. So let me finish my presentation just by giving you some ideas on how the UN development system or the agencies in the UNDS could eventually leverage UNCDF investment architecture. So the first idea I want to put out there is a situation where maybe an agency from the UNDS provides a grant, maybe an agency of the UNDS provides also technical assistance, but we work together, and UNCDF can complement that by providing a concessional loan or guarantee. Next slide. Next. And next. So by doing so, we might be able to attract actually co-investments from other financial institutions, either MDBs, DFIs, or impact investor, or commercial banks, or private equity funds. And again, this is where we will be able to achieve leverage. Next. Next slide. Another way of working together would be that agencies from the UNDS leverage the existing blended finance vehicle that UNCDF has developed. So the Build Fund for SME finance and the IME Fund for municipal finance. And here we could work in a relatively similar fashion, you know, where basically the agency from the UNDS identify the projects. The agency of the UNDS might provide an initial grant, might also provide technical assistance, but then the Build Fund or the IME Fund could provide additional investment. And can you go, Maria, 3 more? 1, 2, 3, exactly. And here again, because we're talking about leverage and wider mobilization, the objective could also be to bring on board additional finance from the same set of investors that we've already discussed before. So here, how does that play out in terms of leverage? Next. We would create leverage in 2 ways. We would create leverage at blended finance vehicle level within the Build Fund and the IMIF, because those are already leverage vehicles. But then we would also create leverage by bringing on board additional finance from other sources. So next. So in summary, going back to my initial slide on the UNCDF investment architecture, this is how this investment architecture and this investment continuum could be put at the service of the UNCTs. You could have situations where basically the agencies from the UNDS identify the projects through the programs and the sourcing capability. They deploy grants when they can provide for sure technical assistance, and then they try to leverage the financing solutions of UNCDF with the objective always to bring on board additional finance and mobilizing additional finance. And how do we create leverage here? Next. By bringing on board financial institutions at any stage of the process. Next. By using blended finance vehicles which are leveraged by themselves. Next. And by bringing additional commercial finance at a later stage from other private financial institutions. Next. And hopefully this is how we can catalyze strategic investment for the SDGs through the United Nations Sustainable Development Group. Thanks for your attention, and happy to take questions. Over to you, Max.
Thank you, Fabrizio. And I think as one comment said, thank you for also bringing it real to some of the work of our UN country teams. And particularly if you are one of the 28 that are submitting to us on the component to call, those are a very important consideration to keep in mind while you are measuring what we would define as one of the key performance indicator of your work and of the UN Joint SDG Fund, which is this mobilization of resources for the SDGs. I'll just, a few reminders. Now it's a discussion time on some of the, core concepts that were described. And I just 2 pointers. So the first one, and I think Chris, but also everyone, in fact, so blended finance and, this should not become an obsession as well as financial leverage, right? So it's not a solution for all the problems. They differ very much from impact area, sector, even cultural connotations. Like in some countries, investment in a specific sector is maybe considered, maybe considered and allowed, in some other not. So that's also an important consideration, as well as what is the the commercial test, the financial sustainability test. So always ask yourself, is that the right moment? Is that the right instrument? The second as well. So you have seen some numbers from Chris and other colleagues, Fabrizio as well, on what could be leverage ratio. I think it's important to remind that we are here also for the SDGs in the first instance. So let's always remind that those are instruments. It's not money for the money itself. It's something that is built to create markets, to create opportunities, to kickstart an action. So don't be obsessed by the leverage ratio. What you have seen also what happens with development banks and the interaction with MDBs is that you will always at the beginning have multiple actors, and some of those actors will be from the private sector. That is very common in the history of capitalism, if you actually wish to look at the past as well in OECD market. The third one, and I think here also Fabrizio spoke about it, is look at is as also as market creation. I know this is important for many countries that you are working with. Is maybe the first transaction of a kind. So the actual counting of this mobilization potential will go for in the years to come. So what you may be able to measure and achieve with the project at a certain point of time is one milestone. But we do hope and believe that this is just one milestone in a path that is to more transactions and actually to try to bring into what is an impact economy. So those are just a few reminders. So now we are in the discussion slot. So you can both. I have a few questions to kickstart that you already put down many. So I will ask a couple to our panel first. But to remind that you can ask to take the floor. So just you should have the option to raise your hand. So please do. You're also most welcome to take and see yourself and speak of yourself. Otherwise, we always also accept and encourage to write in the chat your question. So the first question, while colleagues also think a bit about it, is an old question. But since you were a unique panel, actually, because you were participating also in the evaluation of some of the proposals submitted to the fund. So the question is, what is your perception? And this is really a question to all of you on the value add from what you have seen and your experience of the United Nations system in this game. So perhaps we can go from as your presentation line, maybe from Paul, Priscilla, and then Chris, and then Fabrizio on how would you try to answer the question. This question is of course very important for our teams.
Okay, thanks, Max. Maybe that's me then. Just quickly, I mean, from getting the UN involvement is key. The OECD is often considered as a sort of exclusive club of rich countries. The work that DFI's donors are doing is for development, so it's for the UN community. The SDGs are owned by the UN. That development money is to deliver on those SDGs and the commitments the governments have made. Blended finance will only work with the UN sort of buy-in, and I think still a bit of skepticism around it. I mean, I think UNCDF and Fabrizio has done a lot of good work in terms of the focusing on LDCs, but more needs to be done. More needs to be more discussions like this, more work, and I think Convergence is a great place to sort of learn with their matchmaking, their place in the system in regards to training. And so yeah, I think you've got the right people here on this webinar, but we probably need to do more of this and have more UN participation and UN involvement.
And just maybe to complement that, I think, the UN system has really the opportunity to implement blended finance projects that really follow the principles, because you have the focus on the SDGs, you are locally embedded, The agencies come with a wide range of different expertise in different sectors and countries. And so there is this centrality of impact that I think will give an opportunity to provide track records on projects that can really make a difference.
Yeah, and Max, I might add one thing here. You know, from my perspective, it would be great. Imagine kind of a clear understanding of which different UN agencies have what interest in blended finance and what comparative advantage in each space. So at a very, very high level, obviously we're big fans of the UN Secretary General convening the Global Investors for Sustainable Development. That's 30 institutional investors that we all collectively want to be allocating more funding. There's big organizations, they're alliances, and that's kind of required at a Secretary General level. I think, you know, then we think about UNDESA. What we see here is, you know, as Paul said, the UN is a collection of developed and developing countries. And I think there is, you know, there isn't buy-in from everybody that blended finance should be one of the tools in the toolbox for just reasons. You know, what is the story at the UN level between the developed countries and developing countries of when is blended finance a good tool? Because it is a junior tool, will always be a junior tool. It is not here to crowd out traditional ODA. It's here to identify those opportunities where incremental investment can be raised and mobilized. You know, so at another level, I think about the great work that you guys are doing at the UN Joint SDG Fund. That has one role in blended finance. Obviously, I think about the whole UN Development Program itself and its role in blended finance. UNCDF, as Fabrizio and others said, doing great work, but that's for the LDCs of the world, you know, and that's different. So it'd be great. We see incredibly important for UN to not embrace blended finance, but to strategically engage in blended finance where and when it is the right tool. And you know, what role does each different agency play within that whole equation? It would be good if there was a level of clarity that could be communicated to others and elsewhere, so we know which agency we should be engaging with for what particular activity.
And maybe Max, to complement this quickly, I think there are really 4 areas where the UN development system could bring tremendous value add. The first one is that the UN has boots on the ground. We are present in 150 countries. What we realize is that very often for the private sector, one of the bottlenecks they have in deploying their capital is that they don't have that presence on the ground. And if they were to have it, it would be very expensive and not sustainable for them. But we already have that presence. So that's number 1. Number 2, I think that the UN can have a higher risk appetite. We can really lead the way, go to the last mile and do things that few other actors are willing to do today. And I'm thinking especially DFIs and MDBs that do not always have that risk appetite. The third area where I think we can bring really value add is that we can be the guarantors of the impact, and especially the impact on SDGs. We have been doing monitoring and evaluation on projects for years at the UN, you know. So this is something we master. We are also the masters of the SDGs. So I think that we can bring tremendous value here. And last but not least, but I think it's also very important, is that through our work in this area, we can really contribute to the policy frameworks. We can use our concrete experience and the transaction that we might be doing in the field or we might facilitating in the field to feed the policy narrative, to go to our local government's counterparts and tell them this is what has worked, this is what has not worked, share lessons learned, and hopefully use those lessons learned to feed the new policy frameworks. Thanks.
Thank you, colleagues, for that. And I also think that an increased role of the UN is also because, you know, this impact discussion has moved forward in the financial sector. And while some of the earlier discussion were confined to only financial institutions and you know, quite limited number of actors, now the, you know, several democratization waves had expanded actually the willingness of different type of people as even individual investors or to actually be part of a larger discussion on the SDGs and a bit go beyond what were, you know, very confined roles with the aid sectors and on. So I think this is also part of a, you know, of a different set of dialogue that the SDGs actually have put on the plate as a global. Just one more question, and and then we have a few more for Fabrizio, of course, that was the last presentation. But Chris, maybe this to you, because so you actually mentioned several teams ask, and this is not a question that can be answered generically, but perhaps you have a few tips and also others. So when they're looking at a specific challenge and there is, the possibility or the expectation that actually blended finance or different type of financing can be mobilized, what will be your advice of the key question to ask or the key tools to use if yes, we go or not, we don't go? Like, what from your side will be some of the key questions or pointers to keep in mind? This is one of the core questions that many teams have asked through the process. And maybe Chris, and then also Fabrizio and other colleagues.
Yeah, so on that, just letting you know, we've kind of set up, imagine one was allocating concessional capital to blended finance. We've set up kind of a checklist of what a concessional capital provider should be looking for in a blended finance transaction, right? That there should be evidence of, a certain number of things. First and foremost, we're big fans of, not getting involved when they're not required. At the core of any blended finance proposal needs to be this whole idea of financial additionality. Okay, at the end of the day, is there I'm not going to use the word market failure, okay, because I'm not going to go that narrowly, but we look at, is there a financing need in a particular country or sector or a series of countries and sectors which is systemically underprovided? Number one. If that's true, then number two, understanding why is it systemically underprovided? And then number three, well, what kind of blended finance structure could be implemented to move this systemically underprovided funding to a higher level, whether it's individual projects or a series of projects, ideally a series of projects. And then lastly is, as Paul rightly said, blended finance and really donor or concessionality ideally is temporary, right? And are we then going to be creating some sort of process that's a demonstration effect whereby concessionality can either be ratcheted down or removed completely because now you've demonstrated to others, whether local banks or microfinance institutions or cross-border banks or others, that this type of funding can be done on commercial terms without a level of concessionality. So that's kind of the cascade that we see very generically. We can provide a lot more deals there, but very generically, that's what we see as the core of deciding whether blended finance is good from a use perspective. Now, putting yourself into a donor's position, many donors are looking at, I can allocate money pursuant to a traditional grant, or I can allocate money pursuant to participating in a blended finance structure. You need to demonstrate to that donor that the quote unquote development and development impact you're achieving is either equal to or greater when you're actually allocating the funding in blended finance. And that needs to be a clear case to the actual donor. Without that case, then I think we really fail the demonstration, providing evidence to the donor that the blended finance approach is a good tool.
Thank you, Chris. I'm going over the questions. There were a little cluster for Fabrizio, I think. These, but also others I guess can also complement. It's basically, is there any guidance for what you just explained through the slides? Like, is there any publication or that actually, a bit does what you did us in this meeting, explaining how to actually calculate the leverage? So that's one question, and also for the others, if I don't know if colleagues, maybe this is actually something to think about also OECD and Chris, if we don't have, but the other ones are more on these sequential considerations. So, a bit of, if you could share, some more thinking about it and how better could, for example, this consideration included in a proposal or made as statements. So a bit of those questions for you to Fabrizio, and also colleagues also asked if there are some case studies where you actually showed the similar results.
Thanks, Max. So in terms of guidance notes on leverage, I don't know if there is, let's say, a document that encapsulates all the debates that there has been around leverage in the development community and the blended finance community. What I can say is that the guiding principle of the OECD and especially now the guidance note that they've published on this principle is kind of our Bible here at UNCDF, and we really use it and consider it that it's kind of our beacon. So I would highly recommend people to look at that, because I think it defines really very clear principles when it comes to mobilization of additional private finance, that I think principle 2, but not only. I think it provides also guidelines on how to define concessionality, which is something we haven't discussed today, but which is indeed very important. And I saw there was a question on that in the chat box. So I would really recommend to look at that. UNCDF has also published a publication on blended finance in LDCs, especially together with OECD and Convergence. So I would also suggest people who are interested in the topic to go there. And then last but not least, there are a number of technical papers, most of them produced by the OECD, So for example, what I was discussing about how do you calculate leverage in the case of a loan versus a grant, that is a paper from OECD, and there's been a lot of debate on how to do that. So that's something for sure that participants could find on the OECD document database. Maybe I'll let Chris and the OECD colleagues respond to this one before I take the second question on the sequential unlocking.
Maybe I'll answer. So Max, we have lots of case studies. I think people learn most by looking at case studies, okay? And we've been fortunately funded by Australian DFAT, Global Affairs Canada, and the MacArthur Foundation. If you go to our website, convergence.finance, we've tried to place there all the case studies we've produced and case studies that others have produced in blended finance, where we have their permission to put there. We're trying to create one knowledge place. So if you go to our webpage and you look at under the resources tab and you actually do a filter on case studies, we have more than 30 case studies on blended finance. And so we've noticed that people probably learn the most by looking at individual cases.
Maybe Max, I'd like to take maybe the second question about this sequential unlocking, because I think it's really relevant to what the UN is doing and has been doing, So financial unlocking, the example and the case study I gave is a situation where basically UNCDF provided a concessional loan, and then thanks to the better performance of the companies, they were able to attract private finance. But there are many situations where we could talk about sequential unlocking. Let's imagine a situation where a UN agency provides a grant, and then thanks to that grant, the company develops and is able to provide to access finance. That's another example. Let's assume also a case where maybe we don't provide any capital instrument, but we provide technical assistance, which is something very important. And thanks to the technical assistance that we provide, thanks to the investment readiness work we do with this project, then they are able to access private finance. So there are a lot of ways to look at sequential unlocking, I think. But something I think we have to think of collectively as the UNDS is the need to ensure a connection between what we do and the wider markets out there and the wider capital markets. What I try to say here is that very often we think of our challenge funds, we think of our projects as identifying projects, providing them TA, providing them maybe a grant, but we don't think of what's going to happen beyond that. There is some sort of disconnect between what we do and then what the outside world, I would say, and the private sector in particular, could provide in terms of finance. So I think it's really important to build architectures that think of this continuum. We can be, as the UN, an excellent Kickstarter, but we already have to think of an exit strategy. If we support this great company in whatever country, what's going to happen next when our support finishes? Who's going to off-take that company? Is it a commercial bank? Is it a private equity fund, an impact investor, or a DFI? So it's really, really important that we basically frame our interventions within the wider architecture.
Thanks, Fabrice. I think I agree. This is quite an important element. I think Paul actually started with a concept, right, of mobilization of resources. I just wondered to, if Chris, Paul, or Priscilla want to add any considerations on this aspect of, considering on broader terms what actually resources are mobilized, or if you have any advice to the teams.
Yeah, I would say this. I think, especially when we're looking at UNCDF countries, we should really be trying to maximize the amount of local capital, local funds that actually could be deployed into these SDG projects, right? Because they understand the country risks. They're already there in the market. Unfortunately, if you look at the balance sheet, a lot of these countries, because a lot of these countries, they can't go to international capital markets. They kind of issue securities, government securities that many of the banks actually subscribe to. So many of these deposits end up funding the fiscal situation of the government versus getting into productive purposes in the country. So number one, we should be endeavoring to, in every blended finance vehicle, be looking to maximize the ability to mobilize domestic capital, and certainly, consistent with one of the actual OECD principles, the local context, right? We should be assisting local financial institutions to be in a stronger, better position to be allocating more of their capital. Okay, that's the first sequencing. But ultimately, there is a deficit of domestic capital to finance the SDGs. And then secondly, the sequencing should be, and how and when do we actually be looking to mobilize cross-border investment? And there we have different pools of capital there. We have the traditional quote unquote impact investment community that really is in the business of allocating funding to improve the lives of people. So that is a market we should be looking at. Obviously, the MDBs and DFIs are allocating too much of their funding right now to middle-income countries. We need to get them more in low-income countries. But ultimately, the big money is looking at, I'm going to be honest with you, we need to be focusing the big money on a subset of blended finance, that subset that actually meets their investment criteria. For example, they want to be allocating chunks of 50 million or more, right? And therefore, there's only a handful or a couple of handfuls of blended finance vehicles that really are targeting, the real, what I describe as commercial fiduciary investors that are institutional investors. So that's the sequencing and cascade that we see.
Yeah, I mean, maybe just to complement everything that Fabrizio and Chris have said, I mean, we definitely see the sort of blended finance can be in a grant context. If you deliver the sort of certain KPIs, you give a company $1 million, you deliver those KPIs, you don't have to pay back the whole 1 million, but maybe half a million. So, and I think the UN is a bit like a pathfinder. So they can take the risk. They've got those relationships, that local knowledge in LDCs, but also other challenging environments. So they really can help address the biggest gaps in the SDGs and go to those parts of the world where there's a critical need for finance, but also for innovation and technology, and play that role. And I think we've seen a bit of a step change, maybe not towards LDCs, but from institutional investors like the likes of BlackRock, that now talk about the SDGs and have it in their prospectus to their shareholders, to clients, and referring it to now. So it's becoming, I mean, impact investing is becoming a bit mainstream. I mean, Schroders has bought Blue Orchard. So there's a big shift that's sort of happening, and I think the UN is playing a big role in that and helping to drive and bring along, opening up the projects, the pipelines, but has also got those relationships with actors in developing countries that really allow the local capital markets, the local financing to occur, and local projects to sort of be delivered that are sustainable and impactful.
Any final thoughts as we close the meeting? Thank you, Fabrizio, and you can start, and then we go reverse order. Thank you.
Thanks, Max. No, I feel very bad because there are so many questions in the chat box and the Q&A that we haven't responded. I was trying friendly to do that now before the webinar finishes, but if it would be possible to collect them and then share them with the panelists, and we try to address them as much as possible. But other than that, the message I want to leave here is that there is an opportunity for the UN development system to play a role in this blended finance arena. I see a lot of opportunities. It's up to us to really being innovative and try to do things which might be different from what we have traditionally done in the last years. But yeah, so I would really highly encourage to the colleagues from other agencies to reach out to us we would be very happy to work with them and devise blended finance solutions that can work for their programs. Over to you, Max.
Yeah, and Max, fully echo Fabrizio, going back to the comments, if there's a series of questions, that we haven't been able to answer, we'd be more than pleased to provide our answers to it. But, most importantly for everyone from the UN system, the UN system is incredibly important, obviously, for development of these countries, with blended finance being one of the tools. We're here as a resource. We're funded primarily by Australian DFAT and Global Affairs Canada. We're here a resource for the entirety of the development community to assist them to learn more, to understand good practices in blended finance, working very closely with Paul and Priscilla at the rest of the OECD to kind of take, once policy decisions are taken, how do we implement blended finance from a practices perspective well? We're here as a practices resource for everybody. There's the things available on our website and otherwise, so please, really open invitation, reach out to us and see if we can assist you in any particular area to either bring your knowledge up to speed or your execution capacities in blended finance. That's where we really focus.
Just a big thanks to Max for organizing this, and Lisa as well to facilitate this discussion. Great questions. I would like to explore more of this big issue around the insurance sector, where we sort of focus a bit about where guarantee stop and insurance, particularly climate risk insurance, which I think is a massive area, and we've seen a lot of interest from the private sector. We are working with UNCDF closely. We are working with UNDP, but we really want the UN system